I used to walk past fountains without thinking twice. Then I started looking at old photographs, images from the 1800s showing fountains that should not have worked. No electricity, no modern pumps. Yet water shot 30 feet into the air with perfect, sustained pressure. The engineering required would challenge us today. I began measuring, calculating, examining the evidence with my own eyes. The math did not work. The official explanations collapsed under scrutiny. These fountains operated on technology we supposedly never had, and somebody went to great lengths to make sure we forgot how they worked. I spent months going through archives after that first discovery, examining photographs of fountains from cities across Europe and America. The official story is straightforward enough. Before electricity, fountains relied on gravity. Water was collected at higher elevations and channeled downward through pipes, the natural pressure creating the spray we see in these old images. Simple physics, they tell us. Nothing mysterious. But when you actually examine the evidence, when you look at specific fountains and do the calculations yourself, that story starts to fall apart. Take the fountains at Versailles. We are told they were constructed in the late 1600s, engineering marvels commissioned by Louis XIV. The history books describe an elaborate system of reservoirs and aqueducts built to supply water to hundreds of fountains across the palace grounds. The official narrative sounds impressive, almost plausible, until you start measuring. The main jet at the Leighton fountain shoots water over 70 feet into the air. To achieve that height through gravity alone, you would need a water source at least 80 feet above the fountain, accounting for friction losses in the pipes. But the terrain around Versailles is relatively flat. The famous machine de Marly, supposedly built to pump water uphill, could only raise water to a reservoir that sat barely adequate to explain the pressure required. Contemporary accounts from engineers who visited Versailles in the 1800s describe their confusion. The fountains produced pressure that the visible infrastructure could not account for. I found similar problems everywhere I looked. The fountains at Peterhof in Russia, supposedly built by Peter the Great starting in 1714, feature a grand cascade that rivals anything at Versailles. Water shoots from dozens of gilded statues, the central jet reaching over 60 feet. We are told this works because the fountains sit below natural springs in the hills behind the palace. Gravity does the rest. But when engineers surveyed the site in the 19th century, they discovered something troubling. The natural springs did not provide nearly enough water volume for the displays. The pressure calculations did not match the elevation differential. Something else was powering these fountains. The Trevi Fountain in Rome presents the same puzzle. Completed in 1762 according to official history, it supposedly draws water from an ancient Roman aqueduct, the Aqua Virgo, which delivers water from springs 8 miles away. A gravity-fed system, we are told. Nothing unusual. But the Trevi's main discharge shoots water with force that suggests pressure far exceeding what the aqueduct's modest elevation could provide. The water emerges with violence, not the gentle flow you would expect from a gravity system running nearly horizontal across miles of terrain. 19th century engineers noted this discrepancy in technical journals that have since been largely forgotten. I kept finding the same pattern. The fountains at the Alhambra in Spain, supposedly built by the Moors in the 1300s, feature water jets that dance and play in ways that should be impossible without mechanical pumps. The fountains in the gardens of the Villa d'Este in Italy shoot water in complex patterns that engineers today would struggle to replicate without electricity. Everywhere I looked, I found fountains that predated modern technology, yet performed feats that seemingly required it. The photographs from the mid-1800s are particularly revealing. This was the era before electric pumps became common, yet these fountains were still operating. You can see them in image after image, water arcing impossibly high, spray patterns of remarkable complexity. The photographers of that era documented what they saw without understanding the engineering mystery they were recording. They simply captured fountains doing what fountains had apparently always done, operating perfectly without any power source we can identify. I started examining the fountain mechanisms themselves, looking at what remains of the original infrastructure. In many cases, the pipes and channels have been modified over the centuries, modernized with electric pumps that nobody questions because we assume fountains need electricity. But in some locations, you can still find traces of the original systems. Underground chambers with purposes that modern engineers cannot explain. Pipe configurations that make no sense for a gravity-fed system. Precision fittings made from materials that supposedly were not available in the eras these fountains were constructed. The more I researched, the more I realized this was not a problem with one or two fountains. This was a global pattern. Fountains across Europe, fountains in the gardens of ancient Asian temples, fountains that Spanish colonizers documented finding already operating in the Americas. All of them working without electricity, without steam power, without any technology we are told existed at the time. The official explanation of gravity and elevated reservoirs becomes increasingly inadequate the more examples you examine. These fountains were connected to something else, powered by something we have either forgotten or been made to forget. I kept digging through historical records, and the evidence became impossible to ignore. This was not limited to a few famous European fountains. The same impossible engineering appeared across continents, in cities separated by oceans, built by civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other. Yet the fountain technology was remarkably consistent. The same principles, the same inexplicable pressure, the same results that should not have been achievable. In Constantinople, the fountains of the Ottoman sultans displayed water shows that rivaled anything in Western Europe. The Sultanahmet Fountain, built in 1728 according to official records, featured multiple spouts creating intricate patterns with sustained pressure. The city sits on hilly terrain, but not hilly enough to explain what these fountains accomplished. Engineers in the 19th century surveyed the infrastructure and found underground channels running for miles, far more extensive than the visible aqueduct system. They documented chambers beneath the fountains, containing mechanisms they could not identify. Pipes made from alloys that laboratory analysis dated much older than the supposed construction date. The fountains of Isfahan in Persia tell a similar story. The Naqsh-e-Jahan Square, supposedly completed in 1629, contained fountains that travelers described with amazement. Water shot upward with enough force to splash visitors standing 20 feet away. The surrounding terrain offered no elevation advantage. The nearest mountain water sources were too distant and too low to account for the pressure required. Yet the fountains operated continuously for centuries, their mechanisms a mystery even to the engineers tasked with maintaining them. When restoration teams examined the original pipework in the 20th century, they found precision engineering that contradicted everything they thought they knew about Persian metalworking capabilities. I found accounts from Spanish conquistadors in the Americas that made my blood run cold. When they arrived in Mexico, they documented fountains already operating in cities like Tenochtitlan. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote of fountains in Montezuma's palace gardens that sprayed water in beautiful arcs, comparable to anything in Spain. The Aztecs supposedly had no knowledge of European engineering, no contact with Old World civilizations, yet their fountains worked on the same impossible principles. Water rising without any visible mechanism, sustained pressure without any power source the Spanish could identify. The conquistadors attributed it to sorcery because they had no other explanation. The global pattern extended to Asia as well. The fountains at the Summer Palace in Beijing, the water features at ancient temples in India and Southeast Asia, all displayed the same characteristics. Too much pressure, too much volume, too much precision for the technology supposedly available. Japanese gardens featured fountains that European visitors in the 1800s described as mechanical marvels, yet they predated any Japanese contact with Western engineering traditions. The water moved in ways that suggested forces beyond simple gravity at work. I started examining what remained of the original fountain infrastructure, looking beneath the modern additions. In city after city, excavation projects in the 19th and early 20th centuries uncovered extensive underground networks connected to fountain systems. Workers digging foundations for new buildings would encounter buried chambers, precision-cut channels, pipe networks that extended far beyond what any surface survey had suggested. The reports described the same thing repeatedly. Engineers confused by what they found, unable to explain how such sophisticated systems could have been built with supposedly primitive technology. The pipe materials themselves defy explanation. In several locations, analysis of original fountain pipes revealed metal alloys with compositions that should not have been possible given the metallurgical knowledge attributed to the builders, copper and zinc ratios that require controlled smelting environments, trace elements that suggest industrial processes, pipe walls of uniform thickness that indicate machine manufacturing, not handcrafting. The evidence sits in museum storage and university collections, rarely examined, its implications carefully ignored. The precision of the engineering is equally troubling. Fountain nozzles recovered from excavations show tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The spray patterns these nozzles would produce require exact calculations of fluid dynamics, mathematics that was not supposed to be formalized until centuries after these fountains were built. Yet there they are, physical objects that could not exist according to the official timeline, producing results that should have been impossible. I found technical surveys from the 1880s describing fountain mechanisms in detail. Engineers of that era were trying to understand how these ancient systems worked so they could maintain them. Their reports express repeated frustration. The principles were clear, but the power source was not. Water entered the fountain basins with pressure that exceeded any input they could measure from the supply channels. Something was adding energy to the system, amplifying the flow in ways their physics could not explain. They documented their findings meticulously, but nobody wanted to publish conclusions that contradicted accepted history. The pattern was unmistakable. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, ancient fountains operated on technology that officially did not exist. The evidence was there in the pipes, in the chambers, in the engineering tolerances, in the contemporary accounts of baffled observers. These fountains were not primitive gravity-fed systems dressed up with pretty stonework. They were sophisticated machines connected to power sources we have either lost or been made to forget, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure we never asked the right questions. I started researching what technology could possibly explain these fountains. The official explanation of gravity and elevated reservoirs had collapsed under the weight of evidence. The math simply did not work. You cannot get 70 feet of water height from a reservoir that sits 40 feet above your fountain. You cannot sustain continuous high-pressure flow from springs that produce a fraction of the required volume. Something else was powering these systems, something that has been systematically removed from our understanding of history. The first alternative I considered was atmospheric pressure. Natural atmospheric pressure at sea level exerts roughly 14 pounds per square inch, enough to push water up a tube approximately 33 feet under ideal vacuum conditions. Some historical fountains may have exploited this principle through sophisticated siphon systems, but this explanation falls short for fountains that exceeded those physical limits, shooting water 50, 60, 70 feet into the air. Atmospheric pressure alone cannot account for what the photographs show. Then I discovered references to something called etheric energy in 19th century scientific literature. Before the physics establishment standardized around electromagnetic theory, researchers explored the possibility of energy that permeated all space, an invisible medium through which forces could propagate. Nikola Tesla wrote extensively about harnessing this ambient energy, describing technologies that could draw power from the environment itself without fuel or external input. His work was ridiculed, defunded, and eventually suppressed. But what if the ancient fountain builders understood something similar? What if they had developed methods to tap into natural energy flows that we have been taught do not exist? I found obscure references to resonance-based water systems in technical journals from the late 1800s. Engineers observed that certain pipe configurations seemed to amplify water pressure beyond what the input could explain. Specific lengths, specific diameters, specific materials created conditions where water moved with more force than it should have. They called it hydraulic resonance, documenting cases where fountains effectively pumped themselves once the initial flow was established. The pipes acted like organ tubes, converting vibrational energy into mechanical pressure. These papers were never followed up on. The research simply stopped, as if someone decided these questions should not be pursued. The fountain infrastructure itself suggests technologies we do not officially recognize. Those underground chambers discovered during 19th century excavations contained features that make no sense for a passive gravity system, precisely angled surfaces that could focus acoustic or vibrational energy, channels lined with specific minerals, quartz and copper, and other materials known to have piezoelectric or conductive properties. The builders were not just moving water through pipes. They were doing something with energy, manipulating forces that our modern physics refuses to acknowledge. I examined photographs of fountains before and after major restorations. The differences are telling. In images from the 1850s and 1860s, you can see architectural features on fountains that no longer exist. Spires and spheres and ornamental elements positioned at precise points around the water jets. Metallic fixtures at the tops of spray columns that were later removed and never replaced. These were not mere decorations. Their placement suggests functional purposes, perhaps collecting or directing energy in ways we no longer understand. When restoration teams modernized these fountains, they removed these elements as unnecessary ornamentation, installing electric pumps to replace whatever original mechanism had stopped working. Here is where the suppression becomes obvious. Fountain after fountain across Europe underwent major restorations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The official explanation is always the same. The ancient systems had deteriorated and needed modernization. Electric pumps were installed for efficiency and reliability. But contemporary accounts tell a different story. Many of these fountains were still operating perfectly when the restoration projects began. Engineers were not replacing failed systems. They were replacing working systems whose principles they could not explain and perhaps were not supposed to explain. The timing is suspicious. These restorations coincided with the consolidation of the modern energy industry. Electrical utilities were establishing monopolies. The internal combustion engine was replacing alternatives. Any technology that suggested energy could be obtained freely from the environment would threaten enormous financial interests. If ancient fountains demonstrated that water could be moved without fuel, without electricity, without ongoing cost, that knowledge would be dangerous to those building empires on energy scarcity. I found records of fountain mechanisms being removed and shipped to private collections rather than museums. Components that engineers could not understand disappeared into the estates of wealthy industrialists. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, families whose fortunes depended on controlling energy, were suddenly interested in acquiring ancient fountain equipment. Perhaps they wanted to study it. Perhaps they wanted to ensure nobody else could study it. Either way, the original mechanisms vanished from public view, replaced by electric pumps that everyone accepts without question. The pattern extends beyond fountains to other free energy technologies that emerged and then disappeared in the same era. Tesla's wireless power transmission, Keely's vibrational motors, Schauberger's implosion turbines. Again and again, inventors claimed to have discovered methods of generating power that required no fuel, and again their work was suppressed, discredited, or simply forgotten. The fountain technology fits this pattern perfectly. A method of moving water that required no external energy, that operated continuously for centuries, that was systematically replaced and erased just as the energy monopolies were consolidating control. If they lied about how the fountains worked, if they buried the evidence and rewrote the technical histories and replaced working systems with dependent alternatives, what else have they lied about? The fountains are not an isolated mystery. They are a window into a systematic suppression of knowledge, a deliberate erasure of technologies that threatened the power structures being built in the 19th century. The evidence was there. The fountains worked. And somebody made very certain that we would never understand how. The implications of what I found are staggering. If these fountains truly operated on technologies we have lost, then everything we think we know about human progress is called into question. We tell ourselves a story of steady advancement, primitive civilizations slowly developing better tools, more sophisticated machines, climbing an inevitable ladder toward our current technological state. But what if that story is backwards? What if we are not advancing but recovering? What if the fountains are evidence of capabilities we once had and then lost? Think about what these fountains represent. Moving water is one of the most fundamental engineering challenges. It requires energy. It requires pressure. It requires overcoming gravity. Every modern fountain depends on electrical pumps drawing power from a grid, consuming resources continuously to achieve what these ancient fountains apparently did for free. We consider ourselves more advanced than our ancestors, yet we cannot replicate what they achieved without burning fuel or spinning generators. Our fountains are dependent. Theirs were not. Which civilization was truly more sophisticated? I started looking at modern fountains with different eyes. The Bellagio in Las Vegas, with its famous water show, requires over 5,000 pumps and uses enough electricity to power hundreds of homes. The fountains at the World Trade Center Memorial consume massive amounts of energy just to maintain their flow. Every public fountain in every city park depends on electrical infrastructure, utility bills, maintenance crews, replacement parts. They are marvels of engineering in their own way, but they are also monuments to dependency. Turn off the power and they become silent stone basins, dead without their electrical lifeline. The ancient fountains operated for centuries. Travelers described them working in the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, continuous operation across generations without any power source we can identify. no fuel deliveries, no electrical connections, no moving parts that would wear out and require replacement. They simply worked, drawing on something in the environment that we either cannot detect or refuse to acknowledge. The engineering was not primitive. It was superior to anything we have achieved because it was independent, self-sustaining, free. This raises uncomfortable questions about why such technology would be suppressed. If you can move water without electricity, perhaps you can do other things without electricity as well. Heat homes, transport goods, power machines. The implications ripple outward into every aspect of how we have organized modern civilization. We have built a world dependent on centralized energy distribution, on monthly utility bills, on massive infrastructure controlled by corporations and governments. What if that dependency is artificial? What if the technology to live independently has existed for centuries and was deliberately taken from us? I think about the timing of the great fountain restorations, and I see a pattern that makes my blood run cold. The late 19th century was when the modern energy system was being constructed. Rockefeller was building Standard Oil. Edison and Westinghouse were wiring cities for electricity. Entire economies were being reorganized around energy as a commodity, something to be metered and sold and controlled. Any evidence that energy could be obtained freely would threaten this entire project. The fountains had to be modernized, converted to dependent systems, their original mechanisms removed and forgotten. The same pattern appears across technologies of that era. Inventors who claimed to have developed free energy devices were discredited, bankrupted, sometimes died under suspicious circumstances. Tesla's laboratory burned. Keely's machines were declared fraudulent. Schauberger's work was confiscated. The historical record was carefully curated to ensure that future generations would believe these things were impossible, that energy must always come from somewhere, that there is no such thing as a free lunch. The fountains were just one front in a larger war against knowledge that threatened to liberate humanity from manufactured scarcity. I keep thinking about what else has been hidden. If they could suppress the fountain technology for over a century, convince entire generations of engineers that these systems always ran on gravity and simple hydraulics, what other suppressions have succeeded? What other capabilities have been erased from our collective memory? The fountains are physical proof that our official history is incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. They are stone witnesses to a civilization that achieved things we cannot explain, things we have been taught to believe are impossible. Some of the original fountains still partially function. In remote locations, in places where restoration teams never reached, you can find water features that have operated continuously, since before anyone alive can remember. Local people maintain them without understanding how they work. Engineers who examine them come away puzzled, unable to explain the pressure readings, the continuous flow from sources that should have depleted centuries ago. These survivors are living proof of lost knowledge, operating quietly while the official narrative insists they cannot exist. What happens when the electrical grid fails? When the pumps stop and the modern fountains fall silent? The dependent infrastructure we have built is fragile, requiring constant inputs to maintain. Our civilization could not survive a prolonged disruption to energy supply. But the ancient fountains worked through wars and famines and social collapse, indifferent to the chaos around them because they depended on nothing that could be cut off. They were resilient in ways our technology is not. They were free in ways we have forgotten freedom could look. The fountains are still there, scattered across continents, their original mechanisms mostly replaced, but their stone basins enduring. Some still hold water, some stand dry, their underground chambers sealed off and forgotten. They wait in palace gardens and city squares, silent witnesses to knowledge we are not supposed to remember. I walk past them now, and I see something different than I used to see. Not quaint relics of a simpler time, not primitive precursors to our superior modern technology. I see evidence of what was taken from us. I see proof that another way of living was possible, a way that did not require dependency and scarcity and control. Maybe that is exactly why we are not supposed to know. Maybe the truth about the fountains is too dangerous to the systems that govern our world. Or maybe those who control those systems simply do not want us to imagine that everything we have built on dependency and consumption could be replaced by something older and better and free. The fountains remember, even if we have been made to forget. And somewhere beneath the electric pumps and modern plumbing, the original mechanisms wait, patient as stone, holding secrets we are only beginning to suspect exist.